This is the influence of the Spanish conquistadors in the New World, Part 1, and we're going to start with the treaty that allowed Spanish conquistadors to dominate the region in the first place. The treaty was between Spain and Portugal, and it was called the Treaty of Tordesillas. The two countries were huge rivals and were vying for territory in the Western Hemisphere, and they didn't want to get into a war with each other about who could explore where. So they came up with a treaty that greatly benefited the Spanish. I'm not even sure what the Portuguese were thinking on this. Here's the Treaty of Tordesillas line right here. And the Treaty of Tordesillas basically said that anything west of this line was for Spain to explore and settle in, which is all this territory right here. And anything east of the line was for Portugal to explore and settle, which basically left them with this. So it didn't really benefit the Portuguese in any particular way, but it greatly helped the Spanish. And from this point on, Spanish exploration of the New World became very prominent. Now, Spanish exploration in the New World was led by the conquistadors, translated as conquerors of the Caribbean and Latin America. Eventually, the conquistadors would claim for Spain a huge region stretching from modern-day northern Colorado all the way down to modern-day Argentina, which isn't even on the map, but is down at the base of South America. Overall, 10,000 men total signed contracts with the king, raised money from investors, and recruited armies. Only a small minority were nobles. Most of the conquistadors were actually professional soldiers or sailors, and some peasants in their 20s or 30s who were, in a sense, exercising their own early version of the American dream, at least in South America. Now, since so few of the conquistadors were nobles to begin with, some wanted to go to the New World to claim territory in the name of the king with the hope of winning a royal title from the king, like Duke or something like that. Others wanted to be regarded as heroes. That was the only reason they went. Some wanted to go to spread Christianity, and some others wanted to escape prior failures in their life in Europe and relive some kind of new dream for themselves. But of course, all of them wanted gold, and that was a major driving force in why they went. Most of the conquistadors, however, would never achieve their dreams of glory. There were no titles of nobility ever given out, and most of the conquistadors remained in debt to their investors when they failed to find gold in the New World. But there were some conquistadors that were wildly successful, and the most famous ones. The first one was Vasco Núñez Balboa, who in 1513 sailed to what we call today Panama, and while he was there eventually discovered the Pacific Ocean. Balboa climbed a hilltop, looked over on the other side, and saw this massive body of water that no one had ever even noticed before, at least not the Europeans. No European in all their travels up to that point had ever seen the Pacific Ocean. All of their travels and all their voyages had been in the Caribbean Sea and the Atlantic Ocean. So Balboa is the first to notice this huge body of water on the other side of Panama, or what we call Panama today. Now, noticing the rolling, peaceful waves, he named the body of water the Pacific Ocean, which translates into peaceful. Another famous conquistador was Ponce de Leon, which is, just fun to say. But he's actually significant to this study for a much more important reason. Take a look at De Leon's travel path here and the year that it took place. He sails past the Bahamas and reaches the coast of Florida in 1513. Now, on this expedition, he left his ship and went ashore with small boats, and did some expeditions on foot, most likely at some point running into an alligator, being the first European to see one of those probably, and going, "What is that?" But anyway, the bottom line here is that when he does set foot in that year, and you compare that to the years of the other expeditions that took place in the Caribbean, De Leon is most likely the first European to set foot on what we consider today to be the United States of America. De Leon very likely is the one who, quote-unquote, discovers America, at least the America as we know it here. Now, there are some disputes to that claim. Some people will always say Columbus, of course, and other people will say Amerigo Vespucci, but that's simply the map maker that America was named after. De Leon actually set foot in the earliest record we have of someone doing that. Now, the rumor is that he was searching for the Fountain of Youth, so he might have been a little crazy, and that explains a lot of things about us ever since that time. But nonetheless, it's a pretty significant historical achievement. It's very possible that De Leon is the one who discovered America as we know it. Now, you can't talk about famous explorers without talking about Ferdinand Magellan, who left in 1519 and was the first man to sail around the world. Or at least his crew made it around the world. Magellan and his crew left Spain in September of 1519, went down the west coast of Africa around the Cape of Good Hope, through the Indian Ocean, and into Indonesia. Now, during a stop in the modern-day Philippine Islands, Magellan became involved in a tribal war. Fighting for one tribe, he was killed by a spear from a member of the opposing tribe, and his crew had to continue on without him. Under the leadership of Sebastian del Cano, Magellan's crew continued on into the Pacific Ocean, eventually making its way back around through what is today known as the Straits of Magellan, and back to Spain in September of 1522, about 3 years later. Now, it wasn't a perfect voyage. A lot of the guys died along the way, and out of 5 ships, only 1 made it back. But Magellan's crew did earn the distinction of being the first to circumnavigate the world. Another one of the most famous and most notorious conquistadors was Hernán Cortés, who conquered the Aztecs in 1521. Cortés's expedition started in 1519 in Cuba and led to him going through the Caribbean, around the Yucatan Peninsula, and eventually to the conquest of the Aztecs in modern-day Mexico City in 1521, 2 years after the expedition began. More on Cortés later. Now, aside from the Aztecs, one of the other major Native American groups in South America were the Incas, located in this region of South America down here, a very large empire that reached its greatest peak in 1532. Unfortunately, 1532 is when the Incas were conquered by this man, Francisco Pizarro, 11 years after Hernán Cortés had conquered the Aztecs. The next major conquistador expedition took place in 1539, led by Hernando de Soto. De Soto led his expedition through the southeastern United States as far as modern-day Arkansas. De Soto was one of the most ruthless conquistadors in history. He brutalized the Native Americans that he came across with iron collars and biting dogs. His troops, after he died, decided to bury him at night because they feared what Native Americans would do to desecrate his body if they found out he was dead. A year later, in 1540, Francisco Coronado became the first European to explore the modern American Southwest, going as far east as modern-day Kansas. As a result, Coronado was the first European to see the Grand Canyon, and also the first European to witness the massive buffalo herds that went across the plains of the Midwest. In 1542, Juan Rodriguez Cabrillo led an expedition that went up the Pacific coast for the first time, exploring the coast of the Baja Peninsula in Mexico and the coast of California before eventually turning back. Because of this, there are recognizable statues of Cabrillo all along the modern Pacific coast. And then there was Don Juan, who may not have been as smooth as the name might suggest. In 1598, Don Juan traveled from Mexico into the Rio Grande Valley of modern Texas and abused the Pueblo people that he met all along the way. Although this site looks pretty peaceful right now, this was once the site of the Battle of Acoma in 1599, Don Juan's Spanish soldiers severed 1 foot off of each Native American survivor they came across so they could keep them as slaves and so they couldn't run away. They cut their foot off to make that happen. Yikes. Eventually, these expeditions would lead to the establishment of the New Mexico Territory in 1609, with Santa Fe as its capital. Roman Catholic missions would be established all across the region as well, but the Pueblos eventually became frustrated with Spanish efforts to Christianize them. This led to Pope's Rebellion in 1680, almost 100 years after the Battle of Encomienda. Every Spanish church in New Mexico was destroyed as a result, and hundreds of priests and settlers were killed by Native Americans. The Spanish would regain control of the New Mexico region in the 1730s. But nonetheless, the conquistadors were making their mark across North and South America. Now, as far as the economic effects of the conquistador expeditions, well, the New World gold had created a need for the modern commercial banking system in Europe, and therefore created a banking system in the New World as well. Now, this fueled the growth of European capitalism. A lot of money was being borrowed for investment. Manufacturing and commercialism would boom in Europe and eventually in America as well, and this paid for most of the trade with Asia. So the conquistador expeditions, while not always successful for each individual conquistador, were wildly successful for Europe as a whole. The region where the conquistadors probably made the biggest impact was in the West Indies, in other words, the Caribbean islands. Columbus was confused when he got there, thinking it was India, and called them the West Indies, west of India. They still call them that today, even though it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Now, these islands were important to the conquistadors in Europe as a whole for a couple of reasons. First of all, the islands served as the headquarters for the Spanish while they rested between invasions of the South American mainland. They would stay on these islands, rest up, then get on ships and go conquer something in South America or Central America. And the islands also eventually gave European conquistadors the Encomienda. Now, the Encomienda is the plantation, the sugarcane plantations that existed in the Caribbean islands away from the mainland. As long as they were away from the mainland, they could enslave the local island natives and put them to work on the encomiendas, harvesting various crops in a similar fashion to the way slaves were being treated in North America as well. So for those two reasons, the West Indies became very important to the conquistadors and the European countries. Okay, that's it. Thanks for listening.